and welcome to this event of CIC. Before we start, a small introduction about today's program and about the CIC. The CIC is a not-for-profit organization formed to promote exchange of information and ideas in the fields of education, business, finance, economics, arts, commerce, literature, and many other subjects. It was founded in 2016. It was conceived by some of Chennai's accomplished industrialists and professionals with an objective of creating an intellectual hub for the city's intelligentsia to meet, share, discuss, and evolve transformational ideas. CIC, in short, aspires to be a spa for the mind and the soul. The center regularly invites accomplished Indian and global personalities to share experiences and visions in their respective areas of expertise. It has a strong and diverse membership of professionals, entrepreneurs, academicians, environmentalists, administrators, media persons, and historians who are dedicated towards contributing to shaping the economic, social, and political gradient of our country. Since its inception in 2016, the CIC has hosted more than 160 events. Now we are poised to expand. We are in the process of setting up our own center, and most of you are welcome. You will be part of our programs in our own center maybe from the next year. So this is about the CIC and about today's event and today's guests. We have an eminent personality. You have all heard of him. We'll give a detailed introduction about him later. Before we do that, let's start off this function by lighting the lamp. And I invite Mr. Sanyal to come and please light the lamp. I also invite Mr. Gopal, the chairman of the CIC, to join us on the dais. So today we have a discussion on the book of Mr. Sanyal, which is called The Revolutionaries. He'll be talking about this book in detail. Before we go into the program, I request our trustee, Ms. Neena Kothariji, to come and introduce our guest of the evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Chennai International Center, it's a pleasure to be here with you all today and to introduce a dear friend and a distinguished speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, a multifaceted personality who has had a very diverse and dynamic career. He's currently a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He was the principal economic advisor to the Finance Minister for 5 years till February 2022 and the co-chair of the G20's Framework Working Group. Prior to joining the government, he spent over 2 decades in financial markets and was global strategist and managing director at the Deutsche Bank. Sanjeev Sanyal's rich academic journey includes him being an alumni of Sri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi. Mr. Sanyal later attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship in 2007 for his work on urban dynamics. In 2010, he was named as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. Sanjeev Sanyal is widely recognized for his incredible knowledge and depth of research on Indian history. Mr. Sanyal is the author of a number of best-selling books, including The Land of the Seven Rivers, The Ocean of Churn, India in the Age of Ideas, and the Indian Renaissance. He has also published over 200 articles and columns in leading national and international publications. From experience, conversations with Sanjeev Sanyal are always very enriching, thought-provoking, fun, and I'm sure this evening will also be equally engaging and insightful for all of us. Thank you, Sanjeev, for being with us today, and we look forward to the evening and your new book, Revolutionaries, the other story of how India won its freedom. Thank you.
वन्दे मातरम्। सप्तकोटि कंठा तल तल निनाद करले सप्तकोटि भुजग कर तुरावे सप्तकोटि कंठा तल तल निनाद करले सप्तकोटि भुजग कर तुरावे
शरीरे आहुते तुमी मा शक्ति हृदये तुमी मा भक्ति आहुते तुमी मा शक्ति हृदये तुमी मा भक्ति तुम्हार प्रतिमा करे मंदिरे
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the organizers at CIC for having me at your platform yet again to speak about my new book. Now, I have spoken on the CIC platform before, and on that and one of those earlier occasions, I had also spoken about Revolutionaries. So when I came here, I wanted to be sure I was not going to repeat the same story. So I will tell this story from a slightly different perspective this time. But just to get going, the song you just saw and the slideshow you just saw, that, as you may have realized, is a rendition of the Vande Mataram, but not the first two stanzas of the Vande Mataram that are our national song, but of the third and fourth stanzas of Vande Mataram. Why did I put it up and want it to be performed here? The reason for that is that this was the part of Vande Mataram song that many revolutionaries would sing when they would climb up to the gallows, when they were hanged by the British. So I thought it would be fitting that first of all you saw some of those characters in the slideshow. It give you a sense of what they look like, since they are much forgotten today, but also to hear the song that inspired them. So the book that I have released, it's called Revolutionaries, the other story of how India gained its freedom. So why the other story? The reason is that the usual way in which we hear the story of India's freedom struggle is that we get the impression that it was largely a non-violent movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. Now, while the non-violent movement was indeed an important part of our freedom struggle, it is also the case that our freedom struggle contained a very important violent armed resistance to British rule. And this went back actually to the right at the beginning, to the 18th century, when the British began to colonize India. So there were many bloody instances of rebellion and resistance against the colonization process, which involved the many Maratha wars, it involved the Sikh wars, it involved the revolt of the polygars, which happened right here in Tamil Nadu. But that resistance to the British culminated ultimately in the Great Revolt of 1857, which of course the British completely crushed. After that, resistance to the British in the second half of the 19th century actually diminished considerably. There were occasional revolts, but they were not particularly large. And there would be, for example, the revolt of Birsa Munda in Jharkhand, or that of the Manipuri nobility in Manipur in 1890 or thereabouts. But there were never real threats to the British. But the British were always very concerned that there would be a great revolt against them. And so they actually created a safety valve, which we now know as the Indian National Congress. Many people are surprised to hear that actually the Congress was set up by the British themselves. And the fact that it was considered a safety valve is actually not something I have just come up with. They mention this clearly in their own correspondence and letters. So the initial years of the Congress is quite painful if you read them today, because the members of the Congress were very clearly set up by the British, and the letters they write or the demands they make are painfully loyalist. In fact, they are basically asking for small crumbs from the English. But by the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, a more aggressive nationalism begins to take shape, led by the likes of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and in fact the Lal Bal Pal trio. There was Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal. And so a more aggressive demand for rights, etc., begins to take shape in India, both within the Congress, but very importantly, a new movement, a new armed resistance to the British takes shape. A movement that is known as the Revolutionary movement. Now, the Revolutionaries were, of course, taking on a very old mantle of resistance to the British, which I said, of course, including the revolt of 1857. But in many ways, it was a very modern movement. It was a modern movement because it was inspired, for example, by the Irish Republican movement in Ireland, also against the British, by the Italian reunification movement led by Mazzilli and Garibaldi. They were influenced by the fact that in 1905, the Japanese defeated the Russians. It was the first time in many centuries that an Asiatic power had defeated a European power. So all of these international movements were influencing them. They were, of course, also influenced by cultural changes. Hindu revivalism was a very important part of what was going on in India in the late 19th and early 20th century. You had the Arya Samaj. You had Vivekananda trying to revive Hinduism in multiple ways. You had Sri Aurobindo. Today we remember Sri Aurobindo as a monk who lived in Pondicherry, but in fact, people don't realize this. He is the intellectual father of India's armed resistance to the British in the revolutionary movement. So he was then, of course, known as Aurobindo Ghosh, not as Sri Aurobindo, but Aurobindo Ghosh was a fiery orator, a fiery writer. And he is one of the key characters that inspired the revolutionaries. So was Vinayak Savarkar. So there was this very new movement that was emerging. And It was a movement that was, as I said, a very modern movement. They were not trying to go back to pre-modern India, to the Rajas and Mughal Nawabs and so on. They wanted India to be a democratic republic and to have universal suffrage. Now, this was a very new idea. Remember that till almost 1930, the Congress would actually be demanding only dominion status. It is the first time Indians began demanding for full freedom and independence, to be a republic and a democracy, and for full voting rights for all Indians. It was the revolutionaries who asked for it. And this is specifically written in one of their documents as the Constitution of the Hindustan Republican Association by Sachindranath Sanyal. So it was very forward-looking in that way. And in many ways, that is why one can say that it was the revolutionaries in many ways who envisaged modern India. And yet, in your history books, you barely hear about the revolutionary movements. Now, it's not the case that you never hear about, say, Subhash Bose or Bhagat Singh and so on, but they are almost as if they are footnotes to history. You get the impression that, yeah, they may have done some heroic acts here and there, but they are not really a part of the big story why we became free. So the purpose of writing this book is to show you that the revolutionaries were very much an important part of how India became free. Indeed, not only did they influence the way the British acted, they were a very important force within the Indian National Congress. So much so that they were capable of winning elections inside the Congress. So in 1938, as you may know, Netaji Subhash Bose actually won elections within the Congress for the Congress presidentship against the Gandhians. So within the Congress, the revolutionaries were quite powerful. Now, I'm not going to summarize the long story of every little bit that the revolutionaries did. For that, you'll have to read the book. But what I'll do is give you some examples through the lives of a couple of characters about what the revolutionaries were trying to do. So I'm going to tell you the story of one such character, Rash Bihari Bose. You've heard of Netaji Subhash Bose, much more famous, but there is actually another Bose, older than him, who was in some ways an inspiration for for Netaji Subhash Bose. So, Rash Bihari Bose was one of the disciples of Sri Aurobindo and his writings, and he was very inspired by them. And when Aurobindo Ghosh and his brother Barin Ghosh were arrested in the Alipur jail case, a bomb case, in 1910, Barin Ghosh would be sent off to Kalapani in the Andamans, and of course, Sri Aurobindo was escaped to Pondicherry. But that did not end the first round of revolutionary movement. What it did is it opened up the space for new players. And one of those players was Rash Bihari Bose. He was a young man then who was he was from Chandan Nagar in Bengal, but he was working as a lab assistant and a clerk in the Dehradun Forestry Research Institute. And he decided that in 1912, he was going to try and assassinate the viceroy. Now, he didn't choose a some small character. He chose the biggest guy he could find, the viceroy himself, Viceroy Hardinge. And he decided he was going to do this in something that would really cause a dhamaka. So, remember what is happening in 1911, 1912. The capital of India is being shifted from Kolkata to Delhi. And the official entry of the British into Delhi was going to happen in 1912. So there was going to be a big procession moving into Delhi. Of course, remember at that time, New Delhi had not been built. So they were going to enter what is now Old Delhi or Shah Jahanabad and go down the grand avenue of Chandni Chowk and enter the Red Fort as a symbolic entry of the British to the Mughal capital, symbolizing, symbolizing the legitimacy of the British to rule over India. So Rash Bihari Bose decided that this is the occasion he was going to, this was a good occasion in which to demonstrate Indian resistance. So on that day, when the big procession was going to come, he hid himself in a wholesale cloth market called Katra Dhulia on the first floor with his assistant called Basanta Biswas, who was just a teenager actually. And they hid themselves there, disguised as women. And they had a bomb with them. And they waited till Viceroy Hardinge came on his elephant. There's a grand procession with soldiers and horses and, big tamasha. So there was Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy, on an elephant passing by. And Basanta Biswas took out his bomb and he threw the bomb on the elephant. He was accurate. It immediately killed his mahout and it grievously injured and nearly killed the Viceroy himself. He was so injured that he was hospitalized for 6 months. Now, of course, Rajbihari Bose didn't wait to find out what had happened. There was lots of confusion. So he and Basanta Biswas took off their dress, came out of there from a back alley and escaped towards Old Delhi station, from where Basanta Biswas went off to Lahore and Rajbihari Bose went off to Dehradun. Now, when he arrived in Dehradun, news had just arrived that this attack had happened. So, Rajbihari Bose organized a big event in his institute to strongly condemn this dastardly act of attacking the Viceroy. And he did such a good act of showing his loyalty to the British that when 6 months later, Lord Hardinge came to Dehradun, he was made the head of the welcoming committee. Meanwhile, the clouds of war were gathering in Europe. It was quite clear that something bad was going to happen. It was not very clear what was going to happen, but it was quite clear that Germany and Turkey would end up at war with France and Britain. So the revolutionaries decided that this was an opportunity to do what they wanted to do all along, which was to cause a revolt in the British Indian Army. So Rajbihari Bose reached out to another revolutionary, a Bengali based in Varanasi, called Sachindranath Sanyal. And they began to plan a revolt in the British Indian Army. So they sent out envoys and they themselves went out and infiltrated all these regiments. Now remember, large numbers of regiments were being raised by the British to send out to far corners of the empire where they would have to fight the Turks and the Germans and the Austrians. So they began to infiltrate these and radicalize these regiments. And the date was set for somewhere, I think it was the 20th of February. So I think exactly, we're almost exactly at the date. In 1915, when this great revolt would happen and all the regiments would rise and revolt. Unfortunately, just 2 days before this revolt was supposed to happen, one of the inner circle of this group turned traitor and he informed British intelligence that this revolt was going to happen. So as a result of which, overnight, all the guards of all the armories were changed from Indian guards to European guards. So the revolt did not happen, except in Singapore, where the message hadn't reached that this had happened. And so the Indian regiments in Singapore did revolt and they held Singapore for a full week. It would of course be put down and all the rebels would be shot dead on Outram Road. Ashok, you are probably familiar with that road. So that was the end of that. Unfortunately, the first great attempt to create a revolt, freedom in 1915 through a revolt, failed. Many of these mutineers were captured. They were shot dead. Sachin Sanyal himself was also captured and he was sent off to the cellular jail in the Andamans. But Rajbihari Bose, he disguised himself as Rabindranath Tagore's cousin, got himself some papers with the name P.N. Tagore, and he escaped by ship to Japan. Now the war is still going on, so he still had hopes of doing something. So he then gets in touch with a whole bunch of revolutionaries who were scattered across India. Many of them were followers of Savarkar. So some of them were in North America. They were called the Gadarites. Many of them functioning out of a network of Sikh Gurudwaras. Then a whole bunch of them in Europe. who were based out of Berlin. And he managed to convince the Germans to support the cause of Indian freedom. And so the Germans and their allies, the Turks, began to pump in money into this network. Now, at this juncture, the US was still not entered the war. So, what happened is that the Germans acquired 30,000 rifles in the US, and they found a bunch of ships, and they tried to begin to get these to come to India and land them in various places in India, particularly the Odisha coast, where they had got hold of another revolutionary called Bagha Jotin, who was waiting there to get these guns. So they began to find these ships and move these through Indonesia, which was then the Dutch East Indies. And the idea was they were going to land them in late 1915. And in Christmas Day 1915, they would all converge on Kolkata. Because remember, even though officially the capital had shifted to Delhi, it was still functioning basically from Kolkata, where the Governor General held every year a Christmas lunch for all the senior officials. And the idea was that Kolkata would be surrounded and they would capture these guys and the great revolt would happen after all. Unfortunately, what happens, the German agent functioning in Southeast Asia to guide these ships switched sides again. And he informed British intelligence for a large sum of money. And so the British captured these ships and the ships never made it. Meanwhile, Bagha Jotin does not know that this has happened. He's waiting there on near Balasore, waiting for these ships to come. But the ships never come. Instead, a large contingent of British police and troops turn up in Balasore hunting for him. And there is a big gunfight in which he is killed. And many of the others are killed as well. So yet again, another attempt to free India in this First World War fails. But this also doesn't end. The Germans are still looking around for other people. And they zero in on a bunch of revolutionaries led by a young boy from Maharashtra called Pandurang Khankoji. Now, Pandurang Khankoji is quite an interesting character. He comes from Nagpur. He makes his way to Japan and then out to California, where he gets military training but also becomes an agricultural scientist. And then in the First World War, he makes his way with German and Turkish backing to Persia, where he manages to raise an army of 5,000 between Persian irregulars, Indian revolutionaries, and various other groups. And he is given the support to try and invade India through Balochistan, through Persia, even as another group is sent, led by Raja Mahendra Pratap Singh, to Kabul to try and encourage the Afghans to also help this invasion. Now, this is all in 1916, 1917. And Pandurang Khankoji and his troops basically come up against the British, who also, of course, know all of this is going on. By the way, to their credit, they had superb intelligence networks. And so there is, a battle of wits between Pandurang Khankoji on one side, fighting in the deserts of eastern Iran, and British troops led by, guess who? Reginald Dyer, the person who would later on carry out the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh. Of course, all of this goes on after many adventures. Unfortunately, what happens is that the Germans lose the war. Pandurang Khankoji finds himself trapped in Persia. He escapes to Russia, and ultimately he makes his way to Mexico, where he becomes a very famous agricultural scientist. And much of what you hear about green revolution and all these kinds of technologies and crops, etc., well, they're all invented by Pandurang Khankoji. And he would come back to India in the 1950s, and it is his ideas that in the 1960s would lead to the green revolution. So, very exciting, interesting character. But I'll leave him aside and go back to Raj Bihari Bose. Now, Raj Bihari Bose, meanwhile, has attempted all of these various things, but he's now stuck in Japan. All his attempts have been failures. And the Japanese in the First World War, by the way, were sort of semi-allies of the British. So now the British are heavily trying to pressure the Japanese to give him over. So he has to do something. So he goes into hiding, and he's kept hidden in a restaurant in the back alley of in the back of a restaurant, in a room there, where his host sends him food, but he's stuck in this room. We can't go outside. He doesn't know Japanese, so he's just stuck there. And he knows that the moment he goes out, because there's a warrant against him, he's going to be captured. So what does he do? He'll get deported moment the authorities find out about him. So he's stuck there. Now, once something interesting happens, one of his Japanese supporters comes up with the view that he should marry a Japanese, and then he'll become a Japanese citizen, and then he can't be deported. Now, who is going to marry him? It turns out that his host, the owner of the restaurant, had a daughter who used to bring him the food. And although neither Raj Bihari could speak to her nor she could speak to him, they had fallen in love. But they had never told each other that they had fallen in love. So when this situation arises, this young girl says, I will marry him. So he gets married to this young girl, and he becomes a Japanese citizen. So he ends up living in Japan, and he spends the next couple of decades essentially becoming Japanese, but continuously keeping track of what's happening in India, trying to raise funds for various Indian revolutionary causes, and so on. But then, of course, he can't go back home. Now, you reach now the 1930s, late 30s. And yet again, the smell of war is in the air. It's quite clear yet again that another war will happen. This time again with the Germans on one side and the British on the other side. But this time possibly the Japanese are going to join in it. Now meanwhile, what is happening is that his old friend, remember Sanjeev Sanyal, his old friend in the first attempt to cause a revolt. Now he has been in and out of Kalapani for the last 20 years. In fact, of the last 20 years, it spent 15 of them in Kalapani and five of them outside Kalapani, in which he had tried to create the Hindustan Republican Army and recruited a whole bunch of revolutionaries, including Bismil, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Ashfaqullah. Many of these revolutionaries of the 1920s and early 30s were his. But he had been sent back to jail. But in 1937, he again was released. So he comes out and he's in touch with Raj Bihari Bose. And they said, look, let's have another go at this. So they are discussing all of this. By the way, we know all this because we have their letters. At least the letters sent by Raj Bihari to Sachin Sanyal are still available. I found them with a cousin and I have given them now, some of them to the Nehru Memorial, and some of them are with the Victoria Memorial in Kolkata. So now they are looking around, they are building this up. But meanwhile, what is happening, Subhash Bose has essentially been kicked out of the Congress. And so Subhash Bose also joins them. And so the three of them, one in Japan and two of them in India, begin to reach out to various groups and yet again begin to try to infiltrate all those regiments in the Indian Army. Now the Second World War also starts. So these people are in touch with the Japanese because initially the Japanese hadn't joined in. But the British intelligence, yet again, I have to give them credit. They're fully cognizant of what's going on here. So they capture both Sachin Sanyal and Bose and stick them back in jail. Sachin Sanyal is, of course, infected deliberately with TB, and he would die of TB in the next subsequent couple of years. But Subhash Bose goes on a hunger strike. And the British are forced to send him to house arrest because in the middle of all this war and etc., they don't want Subhash Bose dying on them, but that would cause further confusion and don't want to turn him into a martyr. So they allow him to go back home under house arrest. And many of you will be aware of this bit of the story. Subhash Bose then escapes from home, makes his way to Afghanistan, from where he makes his way to Soviet Union and then ultimately to Berlin, where he turns up in Berlin and asks Hitler for help. But Hitler is not very keen on helping him because he is in the end racist. For all his fights with the British, the last thing he wants is a non-white country becoming free. So he kind of sort of keeps him in Berlin, gives him a house, but doesn't help him at all. So there is Subhash Bose stuck in Berlin in 1942, and he doesn't know what to do. Meanwhile, by a stroke of luck, the Japanese enter the war, and very quickly they overrun Southeast Asia. Malaysia, Indonesia, which was then the Dutch East Indies, and of course Singapore. And they come in possession of a large number of Indian prisoners of war, British Indian army soldiers who basically surrender in Singapore. And so there are tens of thousands of them. And the Japanese are wondering what to do with them. When Rash Bihari Bose, remember Rash Bihari Bose, he had all this while in Japan, he comes up with the idea that why don't I get them to become the core of my new army? So he goes and speaks to them, and immediately he gets tens of thousands of these POWs signing up to form the Indian National Army or the Azad Hindu Fauj, as many of you will know. So many of you sometimes may think that it is Netaji who formed the INA. It was not. It was this old revolutionary called Rash Bihari Bose who actually formed the INA. The problem was that his health was very bad by this point in time. He was very ill. So he realized that he couldn't keep going. He didn't have his trusted assistant Sanjeev Sanyal with him, who was by this point dead in a jail in India. So what does he do? So it then strikes him that why don't I ask Netaji Subhash Bose to join me? So he tells the Japanese, and the Japanese request Hitler to provide Netaji. So Subhash Bose gets into a submarine, a German submarine, and makes his way all the way from Germany out to Madagascar, just off Africa, where he switches into a Japanese submarine, which then takes him underwater secretly to Singapore, where he takes command of the Indian National Army. And then with that Indian National Army, they march into through Burma, and finally in end of 42, into 43 really, that the Indian National Army finally marches in with the Japanese into Burma, and then finally in 1944 into Manipur and Nagaland and so on. So it's in 1944 finally the Indian National Army and comes and they raise their flags in a place called Moirang in Manipur. They also, by the way, Subhash Bose also visits Kalapani and the Andamans, which must have been a very emotional moment, as you can imagine, because that's where many of these revolutionaries had been sent to captivity, and one of the cruelest possible places to be sent. It was almost, people preferred to actually be hanged than be sent to Kalapani. Of course, as you know, the war ended yet again with the Axis powers being defeated and the Allies winning. Netaji, in the end of the war, died or went missing after a plane crash in Taipei, depending on what you view about the matter. And yet again, it may have seemed that the revolutionaries had failed. They had tried repeatedly to cause this revolt in the Indian army. First time they had completely failed. The second time they had succeeded, but that revolt had failed. So it may have seemed that, these guys just are not going anywhere. But that's not true. What happens next is very, very important. In the beginning, remember what's going on in the beginning of 1946. The war has ended. All the soldiers of all these countries, the American soldiers, the British soldiers, the Australian soldiers, they all want to go home. So all begin to demobilize and go home. So the only soldiers left in this part of the world, whether it's in Egypt or Indonesia, which was then the Dutch East Indies, or southern Vietnam, which was a French colony, or Burma, or of course the Indian subcontinent, all of this actually is under the control of the British Indian Army. They are the guys in charge. They are also in charge of all these Japanese prisoners of war. So they are the only power, military power now in charge of all of this. This is the context in which the INA soldiers are put on trial in the Red Fort. Now, this turns out to be a major strategic error of the British, because all this while the British had managed to use wartime censorship to keep secret the idea that they had been, then people knew that Netaji had escaped and done something. But they hadn't realized that it was such a big operation, that he had an army of revolutionaries, an army of liberation that had actually entered India. So this causes an absolute buzz throughout not just India, but also in the British Indian Army. And this buzz of revolt suddenly begins to pop up everywhere in the British Indian Army. This happens in Indonesia, in Egypt. And finally, this revolt erupts in Bombay, now called Mumbai, in the Royal Indian Navy. In February 1946, you have this big revolt in which 20,000 naval veterans go in on strike and rebel. They take control of almost 80 warships in Mumbai harbor. And that is the point at which it became clear that things were really going out of control. Now, seeing what is going on, the British again send in the Maratha regiment to try and control them. So here we are. You have the Navy veterans, their guns on their ships all primed, holding various Navy installations on the shore, all armed to the teeth on one side. You have the Maratha regiment on the other side. And the British asked them to open fire. So after a period of firing, the British officers realize that the Maratha regiment is deliberately firing to miss. Then they asked the Royal Indian Air Force to come in and bomb the ships. And suddenly, the Indian pilots all say that their aircraft have developed engine trouble. Now, this is the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, the British realize that they cannot hold India along anymore. And Prime Minister Attlee announces the Commission for India, the Cabinet Commission on Indian Freedom. So that is how, ladies and gentlemen, India gained its freedom. Thank you very much. Now, I think we have some time for Q&A, right? So I'm quite happy to do Q&A. Yeah, there are quite a few here. Somebody has a mic. Yes, hi.
So in the beginning, you mentioned that a lot of this information is not in our textbooks, and you really can't expect, not many people really of their own will go out and buy a history book today and read it and learn all of these. So how do we get to a point where this percolates back into the textbooks?
So you have to realize that much of the story was actually deliberately left out of the conversation. So what happens is, after 1947, the revolutionaries, although they had such a big contribution to getting freedom, and I gave you just the story of just one man to explain it, but there are many sides to this. Unfortunately, none of the senior leaders of the revolutionary movement survived till independence. Raj Bihari Bose died, Sachin Sanyal died, Bhagat Singh died, Chandrasekhar Azad didn't survive. So almost pretty much no senior leader of the revolutionary movement survived till see independence. So nobody was there to really lead them or even take control of political power when it was passed on. So not surprisingly, one branch of the Congress party, the Nehruvian branch of the Congress party, but basically captured power after independence. And perhaps human behavior is like that they emphasize their own story and deliberately suppress that of their alternative lines of the freedom struggle. So what you had after independence is that the story of the revolutionaries was essentially suppressed systematically out of your textbooks. In fact, many of the monuments related to the revolutionaries were actually pulled down. When you go to see the cellular jail, do remember that only 2 wings of the cellular jail have survived. All the rest was pulled down. Even the little bit that survived almost got pulled down. So it was systematically, many of the sort of shrines to the revolutionaries was wiped out of our memory. What you essentially ended up with was the feeling that, yeah, there were these bunch of people. They weren't completely forgotten, but they were left as footnotes. Some people who did some heroic things, but doesn't really add up to very much. So the first thing that needs to be done is actually this story needs to be told more widely, and my book is one humble attempt to try and bring it back into the conversation. There have been others as well. For example, establishing Netaji's statue on Kartavya Marg, what was earlier called Rajpath. Every year when the Republic Day parade happens, irrespective of who is the current president of the time, the march past will be, if you know Kartavya Marg, at the end of it, you will have Netaji taking the salute every year. So slowly but steadily, the story of the revolutionaries is being brought back. In Kolkata, for example, the Alipur jail has been converted into a museum. Even Victoria Memorial has been converted into a museum to the revolutionaries. So this story is slowly but steadily coming back. And in the end, I think at some point, it will have to be put into those NCERT textbooks, hopefully soon.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, you had mentioned many freedom fighters' names who are not mentioned in our said Indian history. And my question is there any women freedom fighter who face the same problem, that suppression of their identity?
Yes, in my book, there are several of them. There is, for example, Beena Das was one of them who's mentioned in my book. She was young student in, I think it was 1932 or 1933. She pulled out a revolver and nearly shot dead the governor of Bengal in Calcutta University. And she missed, though. There is a family link to this. My own great-grandmother used to practice shooting with her. And my great-grandmother, half jesting, used to claim that if she was the one who had been chosen to shoot, she would not have missed. Now, of course, it would have meant I would not have existed. So I'm rather glad it wasn't her. Any other questions?
Could you partly answer it? But my question, this is news to me that Raj Bihari Bose was behind the INA. Would it be that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was a better marketer than Raj Bihari Bose? That so many are
No,
aware
I
of?
don't think was some competition between the two. Netaji was very much an admirer and follower of Raj Bihari Bose, and Raj Bihari Bose would definitely have thought of Netaji as being a great successor. The problem was a very simple one. Remember, Raj Bihari Bose had been the great leader of the Gadarite attempt at doing this in the First World War. So some decades had passed since then, and he was an old man at this point, and people in 1940s didn't live. Now we routinely live into our 70s. Being in your mid-50s was considered quite old. His health was faltering, so he would not have been able to sustain this. Quite frankly, it was in fact in Cathay Theatre in Singapore, in a very big event where Raj Bihari Bose, in a formal event, handed over the baton to Netaji. So this is not a question of, their aims and objectives were exactly the same. And Raj Bihari Bose was very proud to have handed it over to somebody of the caliber of Netaji.
Ms. Sanyal, there is this story about Veer Savarkar writing a letter to the British, surrendering himself and apologizing for whatever he had done or what. But I did notice in one of your interviews, you said all letters are of a certain category, the language which is used, and therefore it was not an apology. I would like to
Yes,
Get that
absolutely.
part of it clarified.
So you have to remember that Savarkar did write a letter, by the way, in which he wrote, "Your obedient servant." Now, in those days, everybody wrote their "Your obedient servant" at the end of every letter. But Savarkar was clearly not neither very obedient, not a particularly servile person, because if he was, he wouldn't have been put in a jail like Kala Pani for 14 years. Right? It was not any ordinary jail. It was not Aga Khan Palace. It was not the luxury wing of Naini jail. The sending somebody to the cellular jail in Kala Pani was a special form of punishment, where on a daily basis you were being tortured, as Savarkar was, and we have more than adequate evidence of that, and many others, other revolutionaries also have written that. Even after he was released, another 13 years he was kept in Ratnagiri in effective house arrest. So if he was such a loyal, obedient servant of the British Crown, I can assure you the British would not have been so reluctant to let him loose. Maybe they would have given him the Kaiser-e-Hind.
I also wonder, you must have received some brickbats after writing this Revolutionaries.
Not yet. I am waiting for somebody to come and... One of the awkward problems is that I always raise these points and, I say, give me the factual evidence. What is your factual evidence? There is no factual evidence.
So good evening, sir. I have been reading Anuj Dhar sir quite a lot often, and I have a straightforward question, sir. What is stopping Indian government to disclose the classified document regarding the Subhash Chandra Bose? Because BJP is into power since the last 8 years. Now they could close the declassified documents pertaining to Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yeah.
If we are following them as idol of a nation, so we should disclose up now. So please avoid answering in a diplomatic way, sir.
And also, can you take the thing back further, because we have otherwise only in the front. Take it to people further back. Yeah. So let me say that a lot of those, as far as I know, the bulk of those documents have actually been released. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't other documents. The interesting documents, I can assure you, have been destroyed. That's the fact. You can tell that many documents are missing from the numberings, but there was enough time for those who needed to destroy those documents to destroy the documents. So whether it's in Kolkata or in Delhi, there really isn't very much left to be released. I don't know what is left, but I can assure you that there isn't too many reasons not to disclose them. But what we can tell, even for whatever documents have been released, that the Bose family was kept under surveillance for 30 years after independence. So that we can clearly tell. So it is the case that the political leadership of that time did not clearly believe the story of him dying in that plane crash. Now, this is not to suggest that I know what happened to him. I don't either. But it is the case that they had some suspicions that he hadn't died. And they kept track of that family for a long, long period of time. We know this both from the Delhi documents that have been released and the Kolkata documents that have been released. I don't think there are too many documents left to be released. Maybe they are, but I'm personally not aware of what they may be or what they may contain.
Well, what made Aurobindo Ghosh to change course, to change his direction? I understand that he was a fierce revolutionary from Bengal. At that time, it was unified with present-day Bangladesh. And what made him come to Pondicherry and change course from revolutionary to a totally non-violent path?
First of all, he didn't quite go into a non-violent path. So let me explain what happened. And I actually talk about this in my book. What happens is in 1910, I think, when he came to Pondicherry. When he first came to Pondicherry, he saw it purely as escaping from the British. He had no particular agenda beyond just getting away from the British. He was completely still a full-time revolutionary, and for the first few years, he is very much in touch with the whole network. He is doing all kinds of things, sending in articles, letters, etc., keeping the machine running. But somewhere along the way, he changes tack. And the reason he does this is very, very interesting. His view becomes, after a few years, that at some point in time, the machinery of the freedom struggle had already taken shape, and that it was only a matter of time before India gained independence, political independence from the British. So his view was, look, in my lifetime, at some point in time, as it turned out to be, he did survive to see independence. His view was, in my lifetime, India will become free. And this battle we will now win because somebody or the other will push it through. He was concerned that even after winning independence, we will remain culturally and intellectually slaves to the colonials. Now, this is actually quite an incredible insight. Aurobindo Ghosh, who now was transforming into Sri Aurobindo's view, was that the British and colonial project was far more insidious than merely political domination. What they had done effectively is changed the way in which we saw ourselves. So in a sense, Indians had come to see themselves, their religion, their civilization from the perspective of the colonial occupier. So even if you pushed away the British out of the country, it did not matter, because what would happen is effectively they will control your mind all the same. Now, this is quite an incredible insight to have in 1910, because many of these debates about deracination, etc., or decolonization that we still have today, are the things that he writes about in the 1910s and 1920s. So he decided that he had to start this other path, and so he moves to Pondicherry, creates an ashram, and he begins to delve into the Indian texts. Like, for example, he writes the book called The Secret of the Vedas, in which he makes the point that the way we have come to think about our sacred texts, because of the way the translations have been done, is that we have come to see these translations are obviously done by people who did not wish us well. Unfortunately, we have come to see India through their lens. Take the example of the Dravidian movement here, right here in the southern tip of India. The Dravidian movement is the result of Tamil literature and Tamil grammar, etc., being deconstructed by missionaries like Cadwell. So what happened is that the self-image of the Tamil population ended up being from the perspective of missionaries and the colonial project. So what Sri Aurobindo decided is that the rest of his life he was going to start a process of decolonizing India's mind. And that project is still not finished. Yes.
Sheikh.
Can I ask a few girls, or this is supposed to be a girls' college? No, women are asking questions. What is this?
After this,
or maybe it's a girls' college and there's positive discrimination
after
towards.
this question,
Here, positive discrimination means the other way. Yeah, after you.
Thank you. So I have two quick questions. One is I have gone through the entire records pre-independence, which is all online now, thanks to the British Library and the British Council. So I'm just wondering, is there any place where the British say that any of these acts by the revolutionaries are the reason why they actually changed their mind and decided on the independence? Because
there is
in my reading, they just consider these instances as petty nuisance rather than serious points of change of opinion. It was more Gandhiji's satyagraha and ahimsa which were more potent weapons which led them to rethink, and the people's movement, the construct program that Gandhiji unleashed.
So,
Yeah.
there is more than adequate evidence to show that the armed struggle was a very important consideration. These are also declassified. Go and read the British intelligence reports of that time, in which these are all online as well. Read the conversations that are happening in the British cabinet, particularly, for example, what is happening as a result of the naval revolt in India. The complications caused by the fact that the British Indian Army was the army in charge of large parts of India and of the East, from everything from Egypt all the way to southern Vietnam, was controlled by the British Indian Army. So the whole conversation is about this bubbling up revolt that is about to happen. And the revolutionaries are a key part of causing that trouble. They were trying to do it for a long time, but they are clearly succeeding in this. And it's not coincidence that Attlee announces the commission, the cabinet committee on Indian independence following the revolt. So all of these things are freely available, and there are also witnesses who have. For example, Attlee himself is recordedly saying that the Netaji and the INA and the dissensions it was causing in the army were a key part of his decision. So it's Attlee himself is recorded to have said this. Also, you have witnesses of that time, credible witnesses of the time, who also make the statement. For example, there is B.R. Ambedkar, who was neither a revolutionary nor was he a part of a Gandhian. So you can consider him a reasonably neutral observer. And he is there on record in a BBC interview making the point I'm making.
My second quick question is about
We'll have to give one question.
Yeah, the talk that we wanted to include this as part of textbooks.
Yeah.
Now, since this M.O.P. Vaishnav is an academic institution and has some real eminence in terms of producing works, I was wondering, I went through your qualifications, and you're an MSc in economics.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, if you really wanted to do some historical research, you should probably get yourself qualified to do some historical research.
No,
there is something called peer-reviewed publishing.
So I'm not an academic. I have made no claims to be an academic. What I am is an economist, and that's what I claim to be. However, I have written many books of history, which, by the way, are now widely taught in many institutions around the world. And by the way, I will hardly be the first person in history to have contributed in another area of research. There are many mathematicians who have contributed, or historians who have contributed to economics. There are many chemists who have contributed in physics or biology, and so on and so forth. So it is hardly the case that I am the first person to have contributed outside of my field of specialization. I do continue to be a practicing economist, as you may know. And in any case, so that even in Indian history, much of what is given as references by academic historians are from colonial era archaeologists and historians, who, by the way, none of whom had any training and qualification in writing history. So all these writings that are written by all these PhDs, they'll talk about Cunningham. Now, Cunningham didn't have any postgraduate degree, forget about it. He was actually a military engineer. He did all the archaeology that is being claimed. You have Joseph Prinsep. He was a East India Company clerk. So none of those who are being quoted are themselves have any qualifications. So my own view is, what matters is not whether I am a PhD in economics, which I have a PhD in history, which I don't claim to be, but whether the facts I'm bringing to the table are cross-verifiable or not. And they are.
Sir,
Where are you?
Here.
Yeah.
So my question is, you mentioned a couple of times that the revolutionaries were sent to Kala Pani and not jails like the Aga Khan Palace. So what exactly did the British do in Kala Pani? Why is it so notorious?
Yeah. So, of course, I describe it in detail in my book, and there are several survivors of Kala Pani who tell you what happened. So, Kala Pani was where the most notorious revolutionaries were sent, who the British did not want to hang because, while of course because they were too senior or too well known or whatever it was, that hanging them would mean that you would turn them into martyrs and that would cause problems. So the likes of Sachindranath Sanyal or Vinayak Savarkar or Barin Ghosh, they were considered to be too dangerous to have even get hanged. So they were sent to Kalapani, where effectively, if you visit it, you will see it is a long series of cells. You can visit because only 2 sections of it have survived. So they were basically kept in these tiny cells, much smaller than this. Maybe 3 or 4 cells could be fitted on the stage. So they were very small cells made of brick, one small window, and in front open that jailers could walk it up and down and see what they were doing. There was nothing in the cell other than a earthen pot for them to relieve themselves and nothing else, pretty much. And every day they were tortured in multiple ways. They were made to work in an oil press. Some of them were beaten, and they were very often, just for the fun of it, they would be shackled to the wall for weeks on end and stand in their own excrement. And, they would be not given food. They would be forced to drink salt water instead of all kinds of tortures were done. And let me give you an example of one of them. There was a revolutionary called Ulhaskar Dutt. And Ulhaskar Dutt one day had a very high fever. And he was clearly in very bad shape and he couldn't work on the oil press. Despite all the whipping, etc., he just collapsed. So they took him back to his cell and he collapsed there. So the British jailer claimed that he was just acting, even though it wouldn't have required too much effort to find out if he had running fever. Nevertheless, they basically strung him up, tied him to the wall by chains, and then subjected him to several days of electrocution. And throughout this period, he kept screaming. So the whole of the cells could hear him screaming as he was being electrocuted. And after several days of electrocution, he went mad. And Savarkar at this point went on a hunger strike. And so ultimately, he was released. He was sent back to a mental asylum in Madras, what Chennai was called at that time. And he spent many years here in Madras recovering from his mental illness. Now, there is another story to this. The question is, how did Ulhaskar Dutt survive this long period of torture and then obviously mental illness? You see, just before he had been arrested, he was supposed to be married to the daughter who was of Bipin Pal, who was, by the way, his classmate as well, called Leela. So he was supposed to get married to Leela when he was arrested. And they had been classmates for a while and lovers. But of course, he was captured and sent off to Kalapani. And he would later write that the only reason he survived is that through all the electrocution that he was going through and through all the haziness of mental illness, he would see the image of Leela floating in front of him. And that is what kept him going through all these years. So many years later, when he finally came out of mental illness, he went looking for Leela. So this is somewhere in, I don't know, maybe the 1920s or somewhere. He went looking for Leela. But Leela had been waiting for him for many years, but she didn't know where he had gone. But Ulhaskar Dutt had gone to Kalapani and disappeared. So Leela, meanwhile, after waiting for many years, had actually married somebody else and moved to Mumbai. So Ulhaskar Dutt found out that Leela had got married. What could he do? So he came away very sad and he didn't try to reach out to her in any way. He went back, by the way, to becoming again a revolutionary, like many of them would. He got arrested again and many other things happened. But at the time of partition, he was living back in his village in East Bengal, and he then became a refugee in Assam, in Silchar. And when he was in Assam, somebody told him that Leela had become a widow and also was very ill. She had become paralyzed from waist down. So he went to Bombay and looked up Leela and found Leela and then brought her back with him. She was, by the way, a paraplegic, as I told you. She was paralyzed from waist down. But Ulaskar Dutt brought her back with him to Silchar, and in old age, now they must have been in almost 60, they did get married. And he would look after her till her death. So there are all these stories, human stories, that happened as well. I think I'm going to stop now because there's one last question and then I have got to stop.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for the speech. Sir, my question is about Shahid Bhagat Singh.
Yeah.
So during his last days, he says that bombs and pistols don't make revolution. And the whetting stone of, the sword of revolution is sharpened by the whetting stone of ideas.
Yes.
From your perspective, does this thing probably during the fag end of his life, he felt maybe violence is not the right way forward?
Who, Raj Bihari Bose?
No. Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh talks about this in his book, and he conveys this idea that the sword of revolution is not sharpened, is sharpened by the whetting stone of ideas.
Absolutely.
And that guns and pistols don't make revolution.
You're
This is his
absolutely
words.
right.
So probably from your perspective, I'm just asking, does this mean Bhagat Singh probably felt that
Not
in
at
the
all.
long run, his way probably was not right in the long run?
No, not at all. Because we have his writings right till the last day. And he was absolutely unrepentant. And now it is also true of many of the others, by the way. As I told you, many of these revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh was not the only one who was hanged. And he was hanged, by the way, with two others as well. And all of them were utterly unrepentant. And many of these revolutionaries would sing those two stanzas of Vande Mataram that you heard in the beginning to the gallows. Again, representing their lack of repentance. They all wanted freedom. They believed in armed resistance. But what was Bhagat Singh trying to say? What he was trying to say, and this was not just him, all the other revolutionaries also were trying to say. And, very often people would say they were anarchists. Basically, the word for that time, what we now say, we use the word Naxalite for that. So, not surprisingly, many people used to use the word anarchist or terrorist, etc. to describe the revolutionaries. So, the revolutionaries were very clear on this matter that they were not anarchists because they did have a plan and a clear idea of how India would be after the revolution. And so, what did they want? And so, in order to be absolutely clear about this, Sachin Sanyal, in the 1920s, when he was creating the Hindustan Republican Army, he took the trouble in 1923 of writing a constitution, which you can read online. It's the Constitution of the Hindustan Republican Association. And in that constitution, he very clearly lays out what their vision is of what India should be, which is that it should be a democratic republic based on universal suffrage. And I want to emphasize here, I mentioned this earlier, why this was very, very important. Because do remember that this is a radical idea at that time. Even those, first of all, the Congress itself did not want full freedom. It wanted to just dominion status at best. Gandhiji at that time clearly stated that he wanted to be within the British Empire. It was the revolutionaries who were clearly asking for full freedom. Secondly, there were even those who were asking for full freedom did not articulate clearly what they wanted after they became free. Did they want to go back to the Peshwas and the Mughals, or what did they want? So it is the revolutionaries who articulated the idea of a republic and a democratic republic. They also articulated the idea of universal suffrage, because remember, in 1923, even in Britain, the women did not have the vote. And in many countries, even those democratic, even most men also didn't have the vote. It would usually be a small subset who had the vote. So, idea of universal suffrage in 1923 was also a revolutionary idea. So, to call the revolutionaries anarchists completely misses the point, because they had a very clear ideas. And going back to your point of Bhagat Singh, this is the point he was making. When he said, yes, the sword is needed, but there is a book there too. And that is why, you should read many of the documents that they have left behind for us. And they have themselves written books, some of which was underground literature at that time, but now are available on Amazon. They left behind incredible bouquet of writing, whether it's Sri Aurobindo as a monk, Sri Aurobindo as a revolutionary, Savarkar, Sachindranath Sanyal, Raj Bihari Bose, Jogesh Chatterjee. You can go on. They have a wide variety of writings in which they clearly discuss these issues. Thank you very much. I think I've kept you all long enough.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sanyalji. This has been a fascinating story, but unfortunately, it is not a story. It is a fact. It is not fiction. All this happened, and it's high time all of us, get those different perspectives which make this entire story complete. So I do urge you to pick up this book and go through that fascinating story of the other side. We know one side of it. We ought to know the entire picture. So thank you very much, sir. That was fascinating. We are fortunate that Shri Sanyal has also agreed to address very briefly the economists who are here for a special forum of economists. So we would request you to say a few words on the Indian economy for the benefit of the students who would like to know more about the Indian economy, the state of the economy. Yes, please.
Because I think the formal event is over. I'm not going to give a long speech because that's rather boring. In any way, most of what I have to say is well known. You can Google it up on YouTube or something. I give interviews in the press all the time. You know what my views are. So, given that is the case, why don't we now have a more conversational style of doing that? Half an hour of Q&A. Anything on earth you want to ask, it could be, well, it's supposed to be mostly economics, but happy to answer questions on other things as well. So, who has the mic? So, what we'll do is, the way we'll send it, you introduce yourself and then ask the question, and I'll do my best. Fair? And we'll do that for half an hour. Okay,
Check.
so somebody can take the round. Okay, there's a lady here who wants to ask questions. There's another one there, and then we'll make our way through. And those who have not asked a question the previous session get a priority, and then we'll see if there are no questions left. Then we can also ask. Yeah. Okay.
Namaste, sir. I'm Sri Janani from Maharaj College for Women. It was an absolute honor to sit here and listen to you. Since I didn't get an opportunity last time, my question is related to that only.
Okay.
So, like we all know, in 1939s, when the Congress presidential elections was going on, Gandhiji suggested Sita Ramaya's name against Bose, and when Bose got the higher number of seats, Gandhiji quoted that it was his defeat, his personal defeat. So, what was this mutual enmity between Gandhi and Bose, sir?
So, basically, Gandhiji had been the preeminent, leader of the Congress. Although he himself had not kind of been in the Congress committees himself, his nominees were basically running the Congress. Interestingly, the first time that Subhash Bose got elected, he did get elected with Gandhi's blessings as well. So that was not where, it was the second time. So the end of the year, Bose was beginning to do all kinds of things inside the Congress, which Gandhiji didn't approve of. Like I told you right in the beginning, that Bose had very close links for quite some time with the revolutionaries. So he had different views about how things should be done, and including the much more harder line to be taken with the British. So he was not always agreeing with what Gandhiji wanted to be done, but nevertheless, Gandhiji didn't in the first year push back too hard, because the idea was, yeah, he'll have his year, and then that'll be the end of it, and then somebody else would come. But Subhash Bose, having initiated a particularly different path, wanted to continue down that path. Now, this became a far more dangerous for the Gandhian faction, which did not want him to continue down that path. And so hints were given to him that, he should step aside. At which point he said, no, I'm not going to step aside. I'm going to fight this election in an open election. And do remember what had happened by this time, that the elections had stopped being open. They were basically become increasingly much more like Gandhiji's nominees, or some understanding would lead to that. So open elections didn't really happen in the Congress. So he wanted an open election. So he forced that, and he also wanted, I suppose, to demonstrate that the revolutionaries were not a small group of people on the side somewhere. They were a significant segment inside, whether they came from the right and the socialists, etc., but also many revolutionary groups from the left, from the right, including remnants of the Anushilan Samiti, the Swarajists, and so on, who were also around. So the combined force of that, of course, meant that he won against the explicit opposition of Gandhi himself. So yes, it was a victory of Subhash Bose over Gandhi. He was right in saying that. Yeah, next question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Dhwani. I'm from IIT Madras. My question to you is very simple, sir. The two C's plaguing the Indian economy right now is corruption and climate. So just what do we do about it so that we progress in those spheres?
Well, if it was only two things, I'd be rather happy. Well, we live in an uncertain world with all kinds of unintended things and complicated things are going on. Certainly, corruption is an important issue, and certainly complications of caused by changes in climate are also an important issue. They are both very long debates can be held in them, but let me say that in both cases, a few things need to be done. As far as the corruption is concerned, a big effort has 2-3 things drive corruption. One, in my view, is extraordinary powers given to India's bureaucracy and politicians as well, but specifically to the bureaucracy and to the judiciary. over our lives. This is a serious issue in my view. Of course, there's corruption everywhere. And by the way, it's not the case that there isn't any corruption in other countries' bureaucracies. The problem in India is that the bureaucracy has inordinate powers over our lives. So why did the bureaucracy end up with this inordinate amount of power? This happened because our bureaucracy was not designed to facilitate people's lives. It was designed to control our lives. And why did that happen? It happened because the bureaucracy first came into being during the colonial period. And in the colonial period, the purpose of the existence of the bureaucracy was not to give you services, but to make sure that the Indians were kept suppressed. That was the main activity of the bureaucracy. Therefore, the bureaucracy was given all kinds of powers. That's why you had these bizarre rules that you had to get some gazetted officer to sign off on various forms if you wanted some service like getting a passport and so on. Only very recently have we gotten rid of these rules. So this was the control system. Now, unfortunately, after independence, in any other civilized country, what would they do? They would remove these powers. But in India, what happened is that we ended up taking a socialist path, which also loved control over people's lives. So the colonial powers and structures that were created were not reformed. Instead, they were diverted to serve a new master, which was the master of economic planning and socialist control. So rather than getting rid of all of that in the administration, it was perpetuated into post-independence India in terms of further, wanted to set up a factory or do anything with your lives, you needed some license, some permit. And not surprisingly, when you give so much power with no controls over to any group of people, it became corrupt. So that is the source of your corruption. Now, since 1991, we have made a lot of progress. But that progress has not happened through administrative reform, i.e. the bureaucracy hasn't become better. What has happened is that the bureaucracy can do less and less to control our lives. Therefore, all the progress in the last 30 years since 1991 has been by reducing the powers of the bureaucracy, not by improving the quality of the bureaucracy. But my view is that going forward, at some point in time, we will have to carry out serious administrative reforms. So yes, I think my view is that today's bureaucracy, for all its problems, is much, much cleaner than it was a couple of decades ago. Not because they're necessarily better people or anything else, they just have fewer powers that they can exercise to extract rent. But we at some point in time need to get on with the job of getting the bureaucracy to have a much more service orientation rather than a control orientation. And that is one of the big reforms I keep arguing is that the next 30 years has to carry out. So all this while, it was about withdrawing the Indian state from things it did not do. But the next 30 years is to be about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do. And it's not just about the administration. This is also about our judiciary. You cannot have a modern society and a market-based economy without a judicial system that can enforce contracts on time. You cannot have 40 million cases stuck in your judicial system, tens of thousands of under trials stuffing up your jails, and cases never get finished. So I keep making the point, I made this point before and I'm making it again. In the next 30 years, the great reforms of our time has got to be administrative reform and judicial reform.
So, good evening. My name is Isharat. I'm from Royal College. So, as a part of my final year project, I'm doing a research on e-rupee, sir. So, what's your opinion about like e-rupee will replace UPI payments or it will assist UPI payments?
So it depends what you mean by e-rupee. I mean, even the rupee in your money is an e-rupee. It's electronic now. So if what you're meaning is a blockchain based rupee, is that what you're talking about?
No, the central bank has recently.
Yeah, so that's what. When people say, remember, Even the money in your bank is already electronic. So that is not an e-rupee. So perhaps what you're talking about is a CBDC.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So let me say that the existence of blockchain technology does not change the nature of money. The rupee already exists in multiple forms. It exists as coin. It exists as a note in paper. It exists as an electronic form in your bank account. So it will now exist as a CBDC. It's just a new format. It is not changing the nature of money at all. So yes, it's useful, and maybe it will create new forms of payment systems. But I don't think it will have. It is a useful thing in the margin. It does, but it is not what many people, especially people who are trying to sell cryptocurrencies, etc., try to make it out to be. Bitcoins, etc., contain two things. They contain the algorithmic issuance of tokens, which is basically garbage. Anybody can issue a token with an algorithm. You could have done it in the 3rd century BC. What's an algorithm? Just an equation. But the technological shift, which is blockchain is a technological shift. But what is it? It's a distributed ledger. You can keep anything on it. You can do those tokens. You can do CBDC. You can even keep track of paintings. You can keep, if you manage to put a marking on your cow, you can keep track of your cow with it as well. It doesn't really change the nature of money. It's just technology.
Yes. Good evening, sir. So you mentioned that Raj Bihari Bose, he fled to Japan, right? So, it was during the time of the First World War. So obviously there's going to be a lot of crisis here and there, and he was fleeing from the British. How was he able to, move to a foreign country and settle there when he doesn't know the language, and, how was he able
Well,
to
he had a
manage?
very difficult time. So the way he escaped is that first he had to leave Lahore and he went and hid in Varanasi for some time. Incidentally, he was living in my own family home at that time. In Varanasi, my family, although Bengali, are Sanyals from Varanasi. And so he lived in our family home for several months. And then when it became quite clear that the British were closing in on him, he escaped to Kolkata, where he managed to disguise himself as a cousin of Rabindranath Tagore. So he got himself the papers of a gentleman called P.N. Tagore. And in disguise, he then got into a ship and set off sail for Singapore, from where he made his way all the way through, I think, Shanghai or Hong Kong to Tokyo, where he landed. And of course, he knew that he would very quickly get caught, and he didn't have any money as well. So that was the other problem. So thankfully, what happened is that there were a group of Japanese nationalists at that time who were very keen on a philosophy called Pan-Asianism. Now, it's a much forgotten philosophy, but Pan-Asianism was the fashionable thing in Japan in that time, and was the idea of Asia for Asians. So the Japanese at that time were actually supporting a whole bunch of freedom fighters in various parts of Asia, which ironically also included, by the way, the Chinese. So Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, was actually living in Tokyo. And so he managed to get the support of these guys. And so that's how he came to live in Tokyo. And then, of course, there were many adventures after that. It's a long story. I will not repeat it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Sanjeev.
Yeah. Here we have Vijay, my friend, old friend.
Thank you. Sanjeev, first of all, thanks for writing on history. And I think you answered it right, that we so-called armchair archaeologists, you're not like one of us. You actually visit those sites. I've seen you trouble on to the extent to which you write these books. Two questions to you. If you write a book on economics, will it be as good a reader as this? Because when I was young, two subjects, history and economics, I could never finish a book. Number two, coming to economic question, with the Adani saga, how resilient is the Indian economy now compared to, say, 10 years ago? If this happened, you would have people jumping up and giving. It's just created a flutter. What would you say in your tenure, as something that is your legacy that you left behind for Indian economy?
So, well, I have extensive writings on economics, so you can read them and decide. And I, as part of my work, I write all the time. Some of those you know because they come out in my name in newspapers and so on. So you can read my economics and decide whether it's readable or not. There should be one article out day after tomorrow morning and Saturday morning in the Economic Times, so you can read that too. So I'll let you decide that. And by the way, many of you may not realize you've been reading much of my economics anyway. Sometimes it doesn't come out in my names for not this year's, not the 2023 economic surveys, but the previous 5 economic surveys were partly written and edited by me. So much of that is written by me. So you've been reading my economics all the while without knowing it. And of course, I have writings on economics predating my coming to this. I have written books on economics as well. My very first book, Indian Renaissance, written in some time ago, is also on economics. And perhaps a subsequent book will be on economics as well. Now, whether or not, when I do write my next book, which if I write a book on economics, it'll probably be based on complexity theory. I know many people's eyes glaze over when they hear the term complex systems or complex adaptive systems. So the art of writing will be about making it interesting enough to get enough people to read what is a fairly dense theory called complex systems theory. But hopefully I'll make it interesting enough for others to read. And you had another thing, what was the second question, sorry? Yes. So the point is, look, I can't comment on what is happening to specific companies because that's, as a government servant, I can't comment on specific companies. Let me just say that India's economy is now way bigger than any single company. And as far as that particular company is concerned, well, certain questions have been raised. It is the business of financial markets to be given transparent information, and it is incumbent on them to provide that information. And once that information is provided, it is up to what the financial markets think of it, and therefore whatever is the just price for those stocks and bonds and other financial instruments of that related to that group will then move up and down. It is not the job of the government to decide what that price should be. If you put it in cricketing terms, we are the BCCI. Our job is to make sure that the rules are clear, that the ground is prepared, and sell the TV rights. It's not our job to decide how the game will be played out and who will score how much. So, this is not just for one particular corporate group. For every corporate group, the rules are clear. There is an institution, let's call them the umpires, called SEBI. It's their job to enforce those rules and make sure they are followed. And there is the other umpire, which is the financial markets, who will judge them. So, as a policymaker, I would like the whole thing to play itself out. And I can assure you, the Indian economy is in very good shape. Yes, the gentleman here.
So first of all, congratulations for handling Indian economy so well, because the world is facing with recession, galloping inflation, but Indian economy, I am proud to say that Indian would be growing at 6.1% the next year. So that's a proud moment for all of us. But sir, deep inside, do you really think demonetization was a good step? Because stats has a different story.
Okay. So there are two parts to your question about the current momentum of the economy, and the other is demonetization. So let me say that, as you pointed out yourself, that the Indian economy has been quite resilient over the last few years. Obviously, we had a tough year in 2021 because we had to do lockdowns. We couldn't avoid them, but we had to do what we had to do. But since then, we have recovered quite strongly. Many of the policies that we then followed were controversial at that time, in the sense that we did not do what many leading experts were lecturing us what to do from America. We followed our own gut instinct. We took the view that expending all our fiscal and monetary resources, trying to reinflate the economy while we were under lockdown, was a bad idea. We did, however, provide a fair amount of support to the economy, as you know, but we provided it as a safety net. So we provided a safety net to the poor in terms of providing free food to 800 million people. It was available. Not everybody may have taken advantage of it, but it was available. We transferred through the Jan Dhan system small amounts of money, again, not meant to revive the economy. People said, oh, it's too little. Not meant to revive the economy, merely as a safety net. Similarly, we didn't expend large amounts of money trying to sort of reinflate the business sector. We provided a guarantee, blanket guarantee to the MSME sector, and we eased monetary policy so that there's lots of liquidity in the system, just to again safety net against a cascade of defaults in the system. Once the system had been reopened, then we began to expand systems, do reforms and so on. So here again, notice that this is a very supply side oriented approach to economics. We are not trying to do what the rest of the world was doing, which was basically a demand driven Keynesian reopening of the economy. They had a mental view, economy slows down, it's a demand problem, we must spend more and get the economy to grow. Our view was that COVID shock is a supply shock. When you have a lockdown, there's no point in pressing the accelerator when you've got your foot on the brake. It'll just lead the engine to get overheated. So we just provided a safety net and we waited for the economy to open up. And when it opened up, then we did begin to spend, but we spent in a very peculiar way. We spent on infrastructure. Why did we spend on infrastructure? Well, there are many reasons for this. First of all, spending on infrastructure has the highest amount of multiplier effects. Employs people, creates demand for various kinds of inputs and so on. There's a second and even more important reason. Because remember, we were going to run up debts in order to create whatever we did. So it is the best to be able, if you're going to run up those debts, to also create assets. Because those debts we are running up, remember, you in the audience are going to pay it back. So our generation shouldn't leave you back with debts without leaving you with also assets. So we were very clear that we were going to leave you assets as well. Otherwise, a generation from you, some of you will be standing here and cursing us. So hopefully you will not do that. And you will remember that we did leave you assets behind, whether it's highways or bridges or metro systems or whatever it is. We ran up these debts to create those assets. So that was the second reason. The third thing we did, which was very, very different from what the rest of the world did during COVID, was to continue with structural reforms. Again, notice this is a very supply side view of the economy. We did not take the view that we understood how the post-COVID world would be. We took the view we have no idea what's going to happen in the post-COVID world. But we knew whatever it was not going to be a re-inflation of the pre-COVID world. The post-COVID world would have its own technology, its own geopolitics, its own supply chains, its own consumer behavior, whatever it was. And all of these would interact in many unpredictable ways. So, as a policymaker, it was a waste of time trying to revive the pre-COVID economy by just pumping up money into it. So, we had to ensure that the economy was investing in the supply side through reforms so that we was flexible enough into the post-COVID world, irrespective of what happened in the post-COVID world. So, you will remember through the COVID crisis, what were we doing? We were opening up sectors. We opened up the drone sector. We opened up the space sector. We opened up the geospatial sector. We removed all kinds of useless telecommunications related regulations on the OSPs and BPO sector. We privatized Air India. Now, while we were doing this, many people are arguing, why are you doing this sort of, these kinds of things when, middle of a crisis? You should just focus on reinflating the economy. But we took a very strong view that there was no point in reinflating the pre-COVID economy. We had to carry out these supply side reforms, In fact, some of the supply side reforms didn't work out either. I mean, we also did farm side reforms, which I still stand by. I think those reforms are needed. Politically, it couldn't be carried through. That's what it was. But those reforms are needed. So we wanted to be sure that our factor markets and our companies and corporations and our entrepreneurs had as big a field to play on in the post-COVID world when we came out of it. And so when we did, we find that we were therefore more in a position to take advantage of this. And let me tell you also further that our economy is actually currently capable of growing at 8 to 9%. The reason we are not growing currently at 8 to 9% is that we are in some ways restraining the system from growing at that speed. Because you see, the rest of the world is slowing down. If we were currently growing at 8 to 9%, we would be sucking in so much imports at a time that we couldn't export to the rest of the world because they are slowing down. And our current account would go off. So because of this reason, we are actually restraining the Indian economy right now. The RBI is increasing interest rates, right? We are doing fiscal correction. We are doing many other things to restrain the economy from growing too fast, because otherwise our current account wouldn't be able to deal with it. We would be sucking in imports and not being able to equivalently expand exports. So as you know, exports are slowing, so are imports. So that is how we are maintaining balance. But at some point in the future, I am quite certain we will have a time when our economy can grow faster. We will get an open road in front of us. And let me tell you, we will be able to grow this economy at that 8-9% growth rate in whenever we get that opportunity. And I can see there is a lady trying to come up here to try and drag me off the stage. Is that the case? No, okay. Now, yes, you had also a question on demonetization. So the question on demonetization is, what were the objectives of demonetization and what happened as a result of it, right? Now, I was not in government when it happened, so I'm speaking at second order understanding of what was going on. So I'm not speaking as a eyewitness to this to these events. But the understanding of, at that point in time, from what I understand, from what I gather, is that not only was there a large amount of black money in the system, there was a huge amount of overprinting. There were question marks about, for example, supply of paper, etc. That's getting investigated, as you may know. The supplier of paper, De La Roy or somebody, is getting investigated as we speak. There was a huge amount of fake money that had been sent in through Pakistan and others. There was a huge amount of confusion about how much cash was in the system, where it was, and who held it. And large part of it was black money. So what was being attempted at that time is a one-time cleanup of the system in order to understand how much money was in the system, who had it, and of course, to the extent possible, at that time, of course, we have all got used to doing digital payments, but this is a very new thing. Force everybody onto a digital platform. So that is the combination of things that were being attempted at that time. I'll leave you to judge. It's for the citizens of the country to judge how successful it was, but at least on one thing, I think it was very, very successful. We have become radically more digitalized in terms of payments than that is the case. At least I now only use cash for tipping the guy at the hotel valet. That's literally the only use of money I have now. I pay even the panwala I pay with my barcode. So in that sense, it succeeded. Whether digitization would have happened anyway, I don't know. I don't have a any other question? Then I'll stop, because I think I'm beginning to tire as well. Last question. Anyone from the back or somebody? Okay, there's somebody right in the front with mic. It'll have to be the last question because my throat is now beginning to give up. I've been speaking non-stop for about 2.5 hours.
I apologize in advance if it's controversial, the question.
Okay.
On the one hand, we were a milk-starved country, and then with the White Revolution, we became a huge milk producer. At that time, Dr. Kurian has said you cannot have a dairy industry without a slaughter industry.
Without a
Slaughter industry. I mean, what do you do with the cows? And then fast forward to now, India is now one of the largest exporters of beef in the world. At the same time, that has been encouraged by policy. At the same time, we have a ban on cow slaughter. And these conflicting policies have upended and put paid to many lives and livelihoods. So from your perspective of economic policy, would you comment?
So let me say very quickly that there is a lot of discussion on India being a big beef exporter. India is not actually a big beef exporter at all. What it exports is buffalo meat, which is not banned at all. In fact, Hindus across India, in fact, sacrifice buffaloes, and buffaloes are completely different from cows. So I don't think this is really a meaningful side of that question. I think the other question, which is more meaningful, is the question whether or not what about cow slaughter in different parts of the country. Now, first of all, also be clear that this is a state subject in which I have to be careful to comment because I am a central government official. There are some states where it is banned. There are many states where it's not banned. By the way, this is one state where I think it is not banned. I'm not sure. It is certainly not banned in Kerala. It's not been banned in West Bengal, my home state. So there are many states in India where cattle is legally slaughtered. But as far as exports is concerned, we don't, as far as I know, we don't really export cow meat, and it is not a matter of there is no real stoppage of slaughtering buffalo even in those states where cow slaughter is not allowed. Buffaloes are freely allowed everywhere. So no, but if they are doing it, by the way, most of our cattle, by the way, is buffalo. I don't know if you realize this. The bulk of our cattle is buffalo. And there is no ban, as far as I know, on slaughtering buffalo. Most of the milk in India you get is buffalo milk, not cow milk. And there is indeed a ban on cow slaughter in certain parts of the state. That is true. And it does cause problems in those states, which they try to solve in various ways. But buffalo is not a matter of debate anywhere in the country. And is not a matter of debate even in Hinduism. Many Hindus routinely eat buffalo meat. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful and interactive session. Now, may I request Ms. Kiran Verma, Head of Undergraduate Program of Economics, M.O.P. Vaishnav College, to honor our guest.